Everett had always been the kind of man who spoke in measured tones and kept his emotions tucked behind a polite smile. The kind of man who could lie with charm and still kiss you like he meant every word. Ruth used to love that about him, the calm in his voice, the confidence in his step. But lately, she had started to feel like his calm wasn't comfort. It was silence. And silence started to sound a lot like secrets. They'd been together for 4 years, lived together for 2. She knew the way he liked his coffee, black and scolding. He knew she hated morning light, but loved the sound of rain. But in the past few months, something had shifted. He had become more distant, more unreachable, like he was always half somewhere else. And Ruth, always sharp, always observant, started noticing things. The late nights that became routine, the texts he never opened in front of her, the way he said, "It's nothing," a little too fast. The night it finally broke was a Tuesday. Florence had come up in conversation again, and Ruth didn't even try to pretend she didn't care. She'd seen the way Florence laughed at Everett's jokes, head tilted, eyes locked, fingers brushing his arm like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing to Ruth. It never had been. "You're jealous of Florence again?" Everett had said, shaking his head with that same dismissive sigh that made her feel small. "Ruth, we've been through this. She's just a friend. You're reading too much into everything." Ruth stared at him. His shirt was still half buttoned, damp with sweat, like he'd rushed home. His hair was a mess. Florence used to tease him about it. She felt the burn of betrayal without evidence, but she'd had enough of defending her instincts. "No, Everett. I'm not reading into anything. I'm watching you lie to me and pretend like it's my insecurity that's the issue." He looked at her like she'd said something ridiculous. This again? That was the moment. That one phrase. This again. Like her trust being broken was some inconvenient rerun. So she said it, without shouting, without crying. "If my jealousy is the problem, then goodbye is the cure." His eyes flickered, not in shock, but in something worse. Expectation. Like he knew this day would come, and had already decided not to fight it. Ruth packed 2 bags. Not in fury, not in some wild movie scene exit. Just quiet, precise, necessary. She booked a hotel for the night, texted Scott, her childhood friend who always answered, no matter how late it was. She didn't ask to stay at his place. She wasn't looking for a rebound or a rescue. She just needed someone to remind her she wasn't insane for wanting honesty. Scott picked her up outside the apartment Everett still stood in, arms folded, no apology on his lips. And as she climbed into Scott's car, she didn't look back. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the hurt had finally turned into clarity. In the hotel room that night, she stared at the ceiling. Her phone stayed quiet, no missed calls, no texts begging her to come back, just silence. That same silence Everett had mastered for months, except now it was hers. Scott ordered food and didn't ask questions. He knew better. They shared fries and half-hearted laughter. And at some point, when she leaned her head on his shoulder, it wasn't romantic. It was survival, familiarity, safety. The next morning, Everett sent one text. "I hope this is just a break." Ruth didn't reply. She didn't want a break. She wanted freedom. From second-guessing herself. From counting lies. From crying in the shower so no one would hear. She wanted a life where trust wasn't a luxury, but a given. And maybe, just maybe, she'd finally get to build it, without him. The days after leaving Everett weren't as clean as Ruth hoped they'd be. Freedom didn't come in a wave. It came in pieces, slow and jarring, like learning to walk again after forgetting how. She moved in with Scott for a week. At first, She'd told herself it was temporary, just a place to breathe. But the way he made space for her, literally and emotionally, without asking for anything in return, made it feel easier to stay than to leave. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't offer the kind of pity that tasted like control. He just existed beside her, quiet and steady, like a dock waiting for a boat that had been drifting too long. Every morning, he'd leave a cup of coffee by the bedroom door. Strong, with too much cream, just how she liked it. And every night, he'd check in, just with a look or a simple, "You good?" She wasn't, not really. But it was the first time in months that someone noticed without being told. Meanwhile, Everett didn't say much. A few texts, spaced out like maybe he didn't want to seem too eager. Or maybe he didn't care that much at all. Ruth couldn't decide which version hurt more. One message came in a few days after she'd moved out. "Still thinking about you. But I get it." Get what? That she was tired of competing with Florence's shadow, that she'd grown exhausted, trying to believe lies wrapped in calm voices. Ruth deleted the message without replying, because if he got it, he'd have shown her honesty, not sympathy. But Florence didn't disappear either. One evening, as Ruth was walking back from the store, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Just wanted to say, "I'm not the reason you and Everett broke up." Florence. Ruth stared at the screen, unsure if it was a confession or an insult. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The truth had never depended on Florence admitting anything. It was in Everett's eyes every time he defended her like she was the victim, and Ruth was the aggressor. Scott noticed her mood change when she came back in. She tried to play it off, but he handed her a beer and didn't ask questions. Just turned on a dumb comedy they both liked. It wasn't much, but it was everything she needed right then. Later that night, sitting on his old couch in a t-shirt that wasn't hers, she finally let herself say it out loud. "I don't think he ever really loved me. Not the way I wanted to be loved." Scott didn't respond right away. He took a sip from his drink, set it down, then looked at her, not with pity, but with that same quiet understanding that had kept her breathing all week. "I think he loved you the only way he knew how. It just wasn't enough for someone like you." That hit harder than she expected. Not because it hurt, but because it sounded like truth. Everett had always loved her like she was replaceable, like love was a favor he was doing her. And maybe that was the real problem. She didn't want to be loved halfway. She wanted a love that didn't make her beg for attention or compete with someone else's presence. She wanted to be chosen, not tolerated. And maybe, just maybe, Scott saw that before she even did. As the night wore on and sleep pulled at her eyes, she caught him glancing at her. Not the way Everett used to, measuring, calculating, but soft, like he saw every scar and still didn't flinch. And in that quiet moment, Ruth realized heartbreak wasn't the end. It was the clearing. Something was beginning, slow and uncertain, but real. Ruth started looking for her own place the following week. She didn't want to overstay her welcome at Scott's. Even if he insisted she wasn't a burden, there was something inside her, some deeply planted fear of becoming too much, that wouldn't let her relax completely. Maybe it came from Everett, or maybe it had always been there, just quieter before someone like him fed it. She toured 2 apartments, both dull and overpriced. One smelled like mildew, and the other like desperation. But she was ready to take either, just to feel like she had something that belonged only to her, something untouched by the past. One afternoon, as she was scrolling through listings at Scott's kitchen table, he came in, still wearing his mechanic's jumpsuit, hands smudged with grease. He grabbed a soda, leaned against the counter and looked at her screen. "That place," he asked, pointing at one listing. Pretty sure the windows don't open. Bad for someone who likes the sound of rain. She smiled. Surprised he remembered. I'll take whatever gives me my own keys, she said. Even if I have to play ocean sounds from my phone. Scott didn't argue. He just nodded, and Ruth appreciated that. He wasn't trying to fix her, just letting her move at her own pace. The next day, Everett called, not a text. A real call. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity won over hesitation. Hey, he said, voice low, like he was testing the temperature of her silence. Ruth didn't say anything at first, just waited. I've been thinking. Everett continued. Maybe we should talk. Really talk. Not fight. Not accuse. Just understand what happened. Her chest tightened. He sounded different. But different didn't mean better. She'd been down this road before, where he'd seemed vulnerable, just long enough to pull her back in. Then, slowly, the walls would rise again. The charm would return. And she'd be back to guessing what version of Everett she'd wake up beside. What is it that you want to understand, Everett? She asked flatly. There was a pause. I don't know. Us. Where it went wrong. She almost laughed. You don't know. I just think. Maybe you overreacted. About Florence. About everything. There it was. The pivot. The trap. Ruth stood from the couch. Her heart thudding with that all-too-familiar feeling. The gaslight flickering back on. I didn't overreact, she said, voice sharp now. I left. That's called a decision, not a breakdown. He sighed, and she could picture him rubbing his temple, like she was the problem again. Ruth, I didn't cheat on you. I never said you did, she snapped. But you made me feel like I was crazy for noticing things. You made me feel small for asking questions. Silence. And then finally, maybe I didn't handle it right. She shook her head. You didn't care to handle it right. Click. She hung up before he could twist her words again. She stared at the wall, breath shaky, but steadying. That conversation had been years in the making, and though her hands trembled, her spine stayed straight. This time, she chose herself. Later that night, she told Scott. He didn't say much, just nodded and passed her the remote. But as they watched some low-budget movie neither of them cared about, Ruth turned to him. Do you think I'm hard to love? Scott looked at her like she'd said something absurd. No, I think you're hard to lie to. That's not the same thing. Her eyes stung, but she smiled. That night, she slept better than she had in weeks. Tomorrow she'd sign the lease on her new place. It was small, a little ugly, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, so was her life. Moving day was grey and drizzly. Exactly the kind of weather Ruth used to find comforting, before everything turned chaotic. Now, it just felt symbolic. A soft washing away of the old, clearing space for something uncertain, but finally hers. She stood outside her new apartment with a key in one hand and a coffee in the other. Scott next to her with a cardboard box labeled kitchen stuff balanced on his hip. This place smells like fresh paint and poor decisions. He joked. She laughed. Genuinely this time. Perfect. Matches the vibe of my life. Inside, the apartment was barely furnished. Just a lumpy couch left behind by the last tenant and a fridge that made a weird humming noise. But it was clean, quiet, and empty. No Everett. No apologies laced with manipulation. Just her and the echo of her own footsteps. Scott helped her unload for most of the afternoon. They didn't talk much, which was fine. She needed the silence. Not the tense kind Everett used to weaponize, but the peaceful kind, where no one was pretending and nothing had to be earned. As the sky turned dark, Scott stood in the doorway, wiping his hands on his jeans. You sure you're good here? He asked, a little too casually. She nodded. Yeah, I need to be. He hesitated, like he wanted to say more, but settled for, all right, call if anything. She watched him leave, then closed the door and just stood there for a moment, alone. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and smiled to herself. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was something close. Relief, maybe. Space. Possibility. Later that night, she sat on the floor with a blanket, her back against the wall, eating takeout from the container. She scrolled through her phone and saw Everett had posted a picture on his story. Florence, in his car, laughing. Ruth didn't click it, didn't zoom in, didn't try to decode the meaning behind it. For once, she didn't care to know. But what did catch her eye was a message from Florence herself. You don't know me, but I know. What he told you. Just so you know, you were never wrong. Ruth read it twice. There was no apology, no explanation, just a quiet confirmation of what her gut had screamed all along. She typed back, I know, took me a while, but I know now. Then she turned her phone off. She didn't need closure from Florence, or from Everett. Closure was a myth people clung to when they couldn't accept that some wounds just needed time, not explanations. The next morning, Ruth woke up to sunshine cutting through the curtains. Her back ached from sleeping on a mattress still on the floor, but she didn't mind. It felt honest. No pretenses. No pretending to be okay while dying inside. Just a new beginning, raw and real. She spent the day unpacking, hung up a few pictures, watered a cheap plant she'd bought at the corner market, put on some music, and danced barefoot on the cold floor, laughing at herself. And then there was a knock. When she opened the door, Scott stood there holding a small brown box with a bow on top. What's this? She asked. A housewarming gift, he said, pushing it into her hands. Open it. Inside was a tiny desk sign that read, I am not hard to love. I just know what love isn't. Ruth blinked fast, trying not to tear up. Scott scratched the backs of his neck. Figured you'd want something true in the house. She set the sign on her windowsill, where the light hit it just right. Thank you, she said softly. He shrugged. Told you, always got you. And for once, she believed. Weeks passed, and Ruth slowly found a rhythm that didn't include Everett. She didn't check his social media anymore, didn't wonder who he was texting, didn't flinch when her phone buzzed. The silence wasn't lonely now, it was hers. And with each day, the fragments of herself that had been buried under suspicion, doubt, and emotional acrobatics began to rise again. She started painting again, badly, messily, but with the kind of freedom she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about being good at it. It was about doing something for herself that no one could criticize or diminish. Her apartment smelled like acrylics and cheap candles, and she loved it. Scott dropped by often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with that look in his eyes, like he was still trying to make sure she was okay, without making it a big deal. He never pushed, never asked her for more than she was ready to give. One evening, as they sat on her floor, eating noodles from paper boxes, Ruth caught him watching her. Not in that way Everett used to, the what do you want from me now kind of way, but with quiet admiration, like he was seeing something bloom he didn't want to crush. You're different, he said suddenly. She looked up, noodles hanging from her fork. Different how? Lighter, he said. Like you're not carrying him around on your back anymore. She smiled, set the box down. I didn't realize how heavy it was until I put it down. He nodded. Sometimes that's the only way you find out. There was a pause, comfortable but loaded. Ruth studied his face. Familiar, worn in like an old song. Not flashy, not perfect, but safe. Real. I've been thinking about what comes next. she said quietly. Not just work or life. I mean, love. Scott didn't flinch. Okay. I don't want to jump into something just because it feels better than being alone. I've done that before. He nodded, slow and careful. Makes sense. But, she continued, biting her lip, I don't think I'm afraid of love. I'm just afraid of losing myself in it again. Scott looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a trace of irony, he said, Then don't fall for someone who makes you shrink. Ruth felt something stir in her chest. Not quite a flutter, more like a quiet opening. I've never heard it said like that. He smiled, leaned back on his hands. That's 'cause too many people think love's about sacrifice. But the right love, it's expansion. It's breathing deeper, not holding it in. That night, after he left, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, thoughts spinning. She didn't know if she was falling for Scott, but she knew she trusted him in a way she hadn't trusted anyone in a long time. He didn't chase her, didn't corner her with feelings, didn't make her feel like love was a favor she had to earn. He just showed up, quietly, consistently, without needing her to break herself to be worthy of it. And maybe, just maybe, that was love in its purest form. Not lightning bolts, but roots. The next morning, she sent him a text. Dinner. My place. Just us. No takeout. Let me cook badly for you. His reply came fast. I'll bring the fire extinguisher. She laughed too, herself, heart light. For once, love didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like coming home. Dinner was a mess, in the most charming, chaotic way. Ruth had underestimated the stubbornness of her oven and overestimated her ability to multitask. The pasta came out gummy. The garlic bread was basically charcoal, and halfway through chopping vegetables, she sliced her finger and had to pause everything to find a Band-Aid. But none of that mattered. Scott arrived with a bottle of wine and that same crooked grin he always wore when he was amused, but trying to hide it. He didn't laugh. At the burned bread, he just took a bite and said, bold, smoky, like a food critic, judging a disaster. Ruth rolled her eyes and threw a kitchen towel at him. Don't be nice about it. It's a culinary crime. You tried. That's what counts, he said, pouring the wine like they were dining at a 5-star restaurant instead of over mismatched plates and a wobbly second-hand table. They ate what they could salvage, sitting close, but not touching. The tension was different now. Not awkward, not hesitant, just full of unsaid things. It was in the way he passed her the wine glass, fingers brushing hers a little longer than necessary. It was in the way she caught him watching her from the side of his eye, like he was waiting for permission to cross some invisible line. After dinner, they moved to the couch. The cushions still smelled faintly of fabric softener and paint, the remnants of her new beginning. I never thanked you, Ruth said, legs folded under her. For what? Scott asked. For making space for me when I didn't even know I needed it. His expression softened. You don't have to thank me for that. I do, she insisted, because I know what it feels like to have the door closed on you, to be made to feel like love has limits. Scott shifted, turning to face her fully. Ruth, I never opened my door expecting you to owe me something. I just didn't want to see you disappear into yourself. That made her heart twist. Because that's exactly what she'd been doing back then. Shrinking, folding, silencing herself for someone who treated her heart like it was inconvenient. She reached out, fingers resting lightly on his wrist. You never asked for anything, not even once, but I need to know. Are you waiting for me? Scott looked down at her hand, then up at her eyes. No, I'm not waiting. Her heart dropped for a second, before he added, "Because waiting sounds like you're standing still, hoping someone else moves first. I'm not doing that. I'm living, right here, with you. If you're ready for more, I'll meet you there. If not, I'll still be your home base." There was silence between them then, thick and full. Ruth felt tears press at the corners of her eyes. Not sadness, but something warmer, fuller. She leaned in, slowly, cautiously. Scott didn't move. When their lips finally met, it wasn't explosive. It was grounding, steady, like two people who had already been building something. And this was just the acknowledgement of it. No fireworks, just peace. When they pulled back, she laughed softly. "You kiss like you mean it," he smiled. "That's 'cause I do." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of the past few months slipping away inch by inch. And in that moment, Ruth realized love wasn't supposed to be a puzzle, or a trap, or a guessing game. It was supposed to feel like this, simple, sure, and full of breath. Not perfect, but real. The days after that kiss settled into something soft and unspoken. Ruth didn't label it, and Scott didn't push to. It was like they'd both agreed, without saying a word, that whatever they were building deserved patience. It wasn't about rushing. It was about healing, together. They saw each other almost every day now, but it never felt like obligation. Some nights he'd bring over dinner, and they'd eat on the floor while listening to music. Other nights she'd show up at his garage during lunch, balancing 2 sandwiches, and wearing his hoodie. It felt easy. No pretending. No tiptoeing around moods, or measuring affection like it was rationed. And then one evening, Everett showed up. It was just after sunset, the sky bruised purple and gold. Ruth had been painting near the window, old t-shirt stained, and hair pulled into a loose bun. When there was a knock at the door, she wasn't expecting anyone. Scott had texted earlier, saying he'd be late from work. She opened the door and froze. Everett stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, face tight with something between regret and confusion. "Hi," he said, eyes searching hers. Ruth didn't step back, but she didn't invite him in either. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, like this was some casual run-in and not a blatant intrusion. She crossed her arms. "What do you want, Everett?" He shifted, clearly not expecting the edge in her voice. "I don't know. Closure, maybe. I've been thinking about you. About us." She let out a quiet laugh. Not out of humor, more disbelief. "You're late." "I know," he said quickly. "I should have fought harder. I should have—" "No," she cut in. "You should have been honest when you had the chance. You should have cared when I was still breaking my own back to hold us together." Everett's jaw tightened. "It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that," she said, voice rising just enough. "You made me feel paranoid for asking basic questions. You fed my doubts and called it my problem." He didn't deny it, just looked down, shame flickering in his eyes. "I didn't cheat," he muttered. "But I didn't stop her from wanting me to." Ruth's breath hitched. There it was. Not the confirmation she'd been chasing for closure, but an admission. A crack in the polished mask he always wore. "I don't need your guilt, Everett," she said quietly. "I needed your respect, and you couldn't give it." He looked up, pained. "Do you love him?" It was blunt, and it made her pause. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because the fact he was asking now felt almost laughable. "I love the version of me I am when I'm with him," she said. "That's more than I ever got with you." Everett looked like he'd been slapped, but he didn't argue. He just gave a slight nod, the weight of realization finally settling into his shoulders. "I hope he's good to you," he said, voice low. He already is. She closed the door gently but firmly, locking it behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, exhaling slowly. Not because she was shaken, but because that door closing felt like something final. Later that night, Scott arrived with 2 burritos and an apology for being late. He kissed her forehead and didn't notice anything different until she told him. Everett came by, she said. Mid-chew. He paused, waiting. I told him what he should have known the whole time. Scott studied her, then smiled. You okay? I'm better than okay. He reached across the couch, lacing his fingers with hers, and just like that, Everett's shadow was gone. The final part of Ruth's story didn't arrive with grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It arrived quietly, in the in-between moments, in the way her apartment no longer felt like a refuge from the past, but a home she'd made with intention, in the way her laughter came more freely, and her silences weren't heavy with thoughts she couldn't say aloud. It was peace, earned, not gifted. A few months had passed since Everett's visit, and he hadn't tried to reach out again. His silence this time felt respectful, final. Ruth didn't hate him anymore, not really, but she didn't miss him either. What they had was over, not with fire, but with truth. And that was enough. Scott had become a permanent presence in her life, though they still took their time. They hadn't called each other boyfriend or girlfriend yet, and Ruth liked that. Labels hadn't served her well in the past. What mattered was how he made her feel, safe, seen, and unedited. With him, she didn't shrink. She didn't apologize for existing. One lazy Sunday afternoon, they were sitting on her balcony, feet propped on the rail, a record playing somewhere behind them. The sun was dipping low, casting soft light across their faces. Ruth was sketching idly in a notebook, lines curling into shapes she didn't think too hard about. Scott took a sip of his drink and said, You know, I used to think love was this chase. Like if you weren't running or hurting, it wasn't real. She looked up, raising a brow. That sounds exhausting. He chuckled. Yeah, it was. But with you, it's different. It's not dramatic, but I still feel everything, just without the panic. Ruth nodded, closing her notebook. I used to confuse pain with passion, thought the fire meant something deep. But I think love is more like this. He tilted his head. Like what? She gestured around them. The breeze, the quiet, the way their knees touched slightly without tension. This, easy, honest, warm. Scott reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Then I hope it stays like this. Or better. She smiled. Me too. There was no climax, no chaos. Just 2 people who had been through their own kinds of heartbreak, finding a quiet corner of the world to breathe in together. Later that night, Ruth stood at her window, watching the city below flicker to sleep. She thought about everything that had led her here. The girl she used to be, quietly doubting herself in Everett's silence. The woman she had become, speaking her truths, choosing herself even when it hurt. She didn't regret the pain anymore. It had taught her how to protect her own heart, how to demand more than crumbs and call it love. And maybe that was the real win. Not the relationship, not the kiss, not even the new life. It was the knowing that she was never too jealous. She was never too much. She had simply outgrown being loved halfway. As Scott's arms wrapped around her from behind and his chin rested on her shoulder, she let herself sink into that knowing. Goodbye had been the cure, but choosing herself, that was the beginning. The end. Let me know if you want a new title or story next.